Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet sanctuary of words and wisdom, where the ancient stories of Genesis unfold like gentle streams flowing through peaceful valleys. As you settle into this moment of rest, allow your breathing to slow, your shoulders to release their burden, and your heart to open to the timeless narratives that have brought comfort to countless souls across the ages. Tonight, we journey together through the very beginning of all beginnings, where light first kissed the darkness, where gardens bloomed in perfect harmony, and where families learned the tender lessons of love, forgiveness, and hope. These are not merely stories from long ago, but living parables that speak to the deepest places within us, offering healing balm for weary spirits and gentle guidance for troubled hearts. If these words bring you peace, consider sharing this quiet gift with others who may need rest. And perhaps let your gentle support help us continue creating these sanctuaries of calm. But for now, simply be present, simply listen, and allow these sacred narratives to carry you into the embrace of peaceful sleep. Let us begin where all things began, in the profound stillness before the first word was spoken, before the first light dawned, in that sacred space where possibilities waited like seeds in fertile soil. In the beginning, there was a stillness so complete, so vast, that it held within itself every possibility that would ever unfold. Imagine, if you will, this infinite quiet, not empty, but full of potential, like a canvas awaiting the first gentle brushstroke of an artist's hand, or like the moment just before dawn when the world holds its breath in anticipation of light. The darkness was not harsh or frightening, but deep and restful, like the peaceful sleep that comes after a long day's journey. It was a darkness that knew its purpose, to be the gentle backdrop against which light would first reveal its wonder. And in this profound quiet, there moved a presence, gentle as a whisper, patient as eternity itself, ready to begin the most beautiful work ever undertaken. "Let there be light," came the first word, spoken not in commanding thunder, but in the quiet confidence of one who understands the power of gentle beginnings. And light appeared, not sudden or harsh, but emerging like the soft glow of dawn creeping over distant hills, tender and warm and full of promise. This first light danced across the face of the waters, painting golden patterns that shifted and shimmered with quiet joy. The light was good, achingly beautiful in its purity, bringing with it the first gift of distinction, the gentle separation between day and night. Evening came, soft as a mother's lullaby, and morning followed, fresh as a child's awakening smile. This was the first day, but not measured in the hurried minutes we know now. Rather, it unfolded in the unhurried rhythm of eternal purpose, each moment savored like honey on the tongue. On the second day, the gentle work continued. Waters above and waters below were lovingly separated, and between them stretched the heavens, vast as imagination, clear as truth. Picture this celestial dome arching over all creation, painted in the softest blues, holding space for clouds to drift like thoughts in a peaceful mind, creating room for birds to soar and for human eyes to lift in wonder at the beauty of sky meeting earth at the horizon. The third day brought forth the earth in all its fertile glory, From the rich, dark soil emerged tender shoots of grass, each blade perfect in its simplicity. Trees stretched their branches toward heaven, their roots drinking deeply from the earth's generous springs. Some bore fruit sweet with the promise of nourishment, others offered shade with their broad leaves, and still others stood tall and proud, homes for the creatures that would soon fill the world with song. Gardens bloomed with flowers of every hue, roses red as dawn, lilies white as fresh snow, violets purple as twilight skies. The earth itself seemed to sigh with contentment, rich and loamy and alive with the secret stirrings of growing things. Streams bubbled forth, clear and cold and sweet, carving gentle paths through meadows where wildflowers nodded in the soft breeze. On the fourth day, lights were set in the heavens like jewels in a crown. The sun, golden and warm, to rule the day with gentle authority, not harsh or burning, but life-giving and constant, painting the world each morning in shades of amber and gold. And for the night, the moon was placed like a silver lamp, casting its quiet light across sleeping landscapes, accompanied with countless stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet. These celestial lights would mark the seasons, spring with its tender awakening, summer with its full abundance, autumn with its grateful harvest, and winter with its peaceful rest. They would guide travelers on long journeys, inspire poets to song, and remind all who looked up at them that they were part of something magnificent and ordered and good. The fifth day saw the waters teem with life. Fish of silver and gold dart through coral gardens beneath the waves, while whales sang their ancient songs in the ocean depths. Above, birds took wing for the first time, eagles soaring on thermal winds, sparrows chattering in joyful chorus, doves carrying messages of peace on gentle wings. The sky filled with their music, a symphony of creation celebrating itself. Swans glided across still ponds like living poetry, their movements graceful as prayers. Hummingbirds visited flowers with the delicate precision of jewelers, their wings beating so fast they became whispers in the air. And at evening, as the sun painted the sky in rose and gold, birds returned to their nests with the satisfaction of a day well lived, their songs gradually softening into the lullabies of approaching night. On the sixth day, the earth received its final inhabitants. Creatures of every kind walked, ran, crept, and crawled across the landscape. Lions with manes like spun gold, their power held in check by perfect peace. Deer stepping delicately through forest clearings, their eyes large and gentle. Bears lumbering through berry patches, their massive forms belying their tender care for their cubs. In meadows, sheep grazed contentedly, while lambs frolicked in the morning sun. Horses ran wild and free, their manes streaming like banners in the wind. Even the smallest creatures, butterflies dancing from flower to flower, bees humming their industrious songs, ants working together in perfect harmony, each had their place in this grand tapestry of life. And then, in the quiet of evening, when all other work was complete, came the most tender act of creation. From the dust of the earth, not common dirt, but the rich, life-giving soil from which all growing things had sprung, came the first human being. This was not a harsh forming, but a gentle shaping, like a potter's hands lovingly molding clay, breathing into it not just life, but the capacity for wonder, for love, for the recognition of beauty. This first man awoke to find himself in a world made ready for him, every detail prepared with love. The air was sweet with the fragrance of flowers. The streams ran pure and clear, and all around him stretched a garden more beautiful than any dream. He was not alone, for walking with him in the cool of the evening came the very presence that had spoken all things into being, not as a distant ruler, but as a friend, a companion who delighted in showing him the wonders that love had made. Together they walked among the trees, the man learning the names of all he saw: oak and cedar, rose and lily, robin and deer. Each name carried meaning, each creature had its place, and in the speaking of their names, the man participated in the ongoing joy of creation itself. But love, perfect love, recognized that it was something incomplete. "It is not good," came the gentle observation, "for man to be alone." This was not criticism, but compassion, not fault-finding, but the cupbearer promised to remember Joseph's kindness and speak to Pharaoh about his case, but once restored to his comfortable position at court, he forgot all about the Hebrew prisoner who had interpreted his dream. Joseph remained in prison, his hopes of early release dashed, learning patience in the hardest school of all, the school of delayed justice and seemingly forgotten promises. 2 more years passed before Joseph's moment of destiny arrived, announced by Pharaoh's own troubled dreams that none of his wise men could interpret. The cupbearer finally remembered the Hebrew prisoner who had such skill with dreams, and Joseph was hastily brought from prison, cleaned and properly clothed, and presented to the most powerful man in the world. Pharaoh's dreams of 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean cows, of 7 full ears of grain consumed by 7 thin ears, carried a message of urgent importance for the entire nation. Joseph's interpretation, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, was accompanied by practical advice for managing the crisis through careful planning and storage during the good years. The wisdom and insight Joseph displayed in that audience changed his life forever. Not only did Pharaoh accept his interpretation, but he placed Joseph in charge of implementing the plan, making him second only to Pharaoh himself in authority over all Egypt. At 30 years old, the Hebrew slave became the most powerful man in the world after Pharaoh, with authority to tax the abundance of the good years and distribute the stored grain during the years of famine. The years of abundance came exactly as predicted, and under Joseph's administration, Egypt stored grain in quantities so vast they stopped measuring it. When the 7 years of famine began, not only Egypt, but all the surrounding nations came to buy grain from the storehouses Joseph had built. The young man whose brothers had sold him into slavery 22 years earlier had become the savior of the known world. It was this famine that finally brought Joseph face to face with his past, when Jacob sent 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain, keeping only Benjamin, Rachel's other son, at home. When the brothers presented themselves before the governor of Egypt, they did not recognize the powerful official as the brother they had sold into slavery 22 years earlier. But Joseph recognized them immediately, and the moment he had dreamed of since childhood, when his family would bow down before him, was finally fulfilled. The process of revelation and reconciliation that followed was both tender and dramatic. Joseph tested his brothers to see if they had changed, whether they had learned compassion, whether they would protect Benjamin as they had failed to protect him. When Judah offered to become a slave in Benjamin's place, proving that his heart had indeed been transformed by years of living with the consequences of their earlier cruelty, Joseph could contain himself no longer. "I am Joseph," he cried, dismissing all his attendants so that only his family was present for this most intimate of moments. "Is my father still alive?"
The words carried all the longing of decades of separation, all the love that had never died despite betrayal and abandonment, all the wonder of dreams finally fulfilled in ways none of them could have imagined. The brothers were terrified, expecting revenge for their ancient crime, but Joseph's response revealed how completely his heart had been transformed by his journey through slavery and imprisonment. "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. It was not you who sent me here, but God, and He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." The reunion with his father Jacob was the culmination of Joseph's triumph over all the forces that had tried to destroy him. The old patriarch, who had mourned his favorite son as dead for more than 20 years, found himself embracing not a broken victim, but a powerful ruler who had been preserved and elevated for purposes far greater than anyone could have imagined. Jacob's family, 70 people in all, settled in the land of Goshen, where they prospered and multiplied under Joseph's protection, laying the foundation for the great nation they would eventually become. The dreams of Joseph's youth had been fulfilled, but in ways that brought blessing not only to him, but to his entire family, and indeed to all the nations of the earth who had been saved from famine by his wise administration. When Jacob died, blessing each of his sons and confirming that the covenant promises would continue through their descendants, Joseph wept with grief that was deeper for being mixed with joy. He had been reconciled not only with his brothers but with his father, not only with his past but with his destiny. The dreams that had once seemed like cruel mockeries had proven to be prophetic visions of a future none of them could have imagined. Joseph lived to be 110 years old, long enough to see his great-great-grandchildren, long enough to know that the promise given to Abraham was being fulfilled through the rapid multiplication of Jacob's descendants in Egypt. When he felt death approaching, he gathered his family around him and spoke words that revealed his unshakable faith in God's covenant promises. "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that He swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Even in Egypt, even after a lifetime of success and honor in a foreign land, Joseph's heart remained fixed on the promise of a homeland for his people, a future that would require another exodus, another journey of faith. He made his family swear that when God led them back to the promised land, they would carry his bones with them, so that even in death he would be part of the homecoming he would not live to see. It was a final act of faith, a declaration that his identity remained rooted not in his Egyptian honors, but in his membership in the covenant family, not in his earthly achievements, but in his participation in God's eternal purposes. The story of Joseph became a testament to the mysterious ways in which God brings good out of evil, hope out of despair, blessing out of betrayal. It showed that no pit is too deep for divine rescue, no prison too secure for divine deliverance, no dream too impossible for divine fulfillment. In Joseph's journey from favored son to slave to prisoner to ruler, generations of believers would find encouragement for their own dark nights of the soul, their own seasons of waiting, their own struggles to trust when understanding fails. Most of all, Joseph's story revealed the transforming power of forgiveness, the way love can triumph over hatred, the possibility of redemption even when relationships seem irretrievably broken. In his embrace of the brothers who had betrayed him, in his care for the father who had unknowingly contributed to his suffering through favoritism, in his protection of the family that had rejected him, Joseph demonstrated that grace is stronger than justice, mercy more powerful than revenge, love more enduring than any force that tries to destroy it. As the sun set on Joseph's long and remarkable life, it rose on a future filled with promise for the descendants of Jacob, now numerous as the stars Abraham had been promised to see. The stage was set for the next chapter in the great drama of redemption, the story of how a family would become a nation, how slaves would become free, how a promise made to one man would become a blessing for all the families of the earth.
Behold, I am with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, came the assurance he desperately needed. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. The dream was both comfort and commission, assurance that despite his deceptive methods, God's purposes would be accomplished through him, that the covenant was not dependent on human perfection, but on divine faithfulness. When Jacob woke from his dream, he set up his stone pillow as a memorial pillar and named the place Bethel, meaning house of God, recognizing that the presence he had encountered there was not limited to any single location, but would accompany him wherever his journey might lead. The vows he made revealed both his calculating nature and his growing faith. If God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. The road ahead would be long and difficult, marked by years of labor, family conflicts, and gradual transformation from the heel-grabbing deceiver into Israel, the one who strives with God and prevails. But the foundation had been laid, not just in the promises received, but in the recognition that those promises came not because of human merit, but because of divine grace, not because of perfect obedience, but because of persistent faith. Meanwhile, Esau eventually found his own path forward, marrying and establishing himself in the land of Seir, becoming the father of the Edomite nation, fulfilling his own destiny, even though it differed from the covenant line. The brothers would meet again, years later, and find a way to reconciliation that honored both their differences and their shared heritage. The story of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau became a testament to the complex ways in which God's purposes work themselves out through human families, despite human failures and conflicts. It showed that the covenant promises are not dependent on perfect people, but on a perfect God, who is able to bring good from even the most tangled human situations, who can use even deception and rivalry to accomplish his will while never approving of the sin involved. In their struggles and reconciliations, in their different gifts and destinies, in their gradual learning to live with the consequences of their choices, we see reflections of our own family stories, our own struggles with favoritism and rivalry, our own need for grace that covers our failures, and love that never gives up on us, even when we have given up on ourselves. In the household of Jacob, now called Israel, after his wrestling match with the divine messenger, there was born a son who would change the destiny of nations through the strange alchemy of dreams, betrayal, and forgiveness. Joseph came into the world when his father was already old, the first child of Rachel, the beloved wife for whom Jacob had labored 14 years and whom he loved more than life itself. From his earliest days, Joseph was different from his older brothers. Not better, necessarily, but different in ways that created both wonder and tension in the sprawling family that had grown up around Jacob's various wives and concubines. Where his brothers were practical and straightforward, Joseph was imaginative and complex. Where they saw only the immediate reality of flocks and fields, he saw patterns and possibilities, connections and meanings that others missed. Jacob, remembering his own experience as a younger son who had unexpectedly inherited the covenant promises, felt a special affection for this late-born child of his beloved Rachel. Perhaps he saw in Joseph's thoughtful nature something of his own contemplative spirit, or perhaps he simply loved him as the living reminder of the woman who had been the joy of his heart. Whatever the reason, Jacob made no attempt to hide his favoritism, crafting for Joseph a coat of many colors, a garment so beautiful and elaborate that it marked its wearer as someone set apart from ordinary labor, someone destined for leadership rather than manual work. The coat was a gift of love, but it was also a declaration that created resentment among Joseph's older brothers. They had spent their lives caring for their father's flocks, enduring the hardships of nomadic life, proving their worth through daily labor. Now their youngest brother, barely 17, was being treated like a prince, while they remained common shepherds. The favoritism was obvious, painful, and increasingly difficult to bear with patience. Joseph's dreams only made the situation worse. The first dream came to him with such vividness that he could not keep it to himself, despite the wisdom that might have suggested discretion. "Hear this dream that I have dreamed," he announced to his brothers with the thoughtless enthusiasm of youth. "Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." The symbolism was unmistakable, and his brother's response was immediate. "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" Their anger was understandable. This pampered younger brother was not only enjoying their father's favoritism, but now claiming to have received divine confirmation of his superiority over them. The dream might have been genuine, but Joseph's eagerness to share it revealed a lack of wisdom that would cost him dearly. The second dream was even more provocative. "Behold, I have dreamed another dream," he continued, apparently oblivious to the growing storm clouds in his brothers' faces. "Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." This time, even Jacob was disturbed by the implications, rebuking his favored son with words that carried both concern and correction. "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" Yet even as he spoke the rebuke, Jacob pondered the dreams in his heart, remembering his own encounters with divine visions, wondering if perhaps his son had indeed been given glimpses of a future that human understanding could not yet grasp. The old patriarch had learned through long experience that God's ways often differed dramatically from human expectations, that the younger could indeed be exalted over the older, that divine purposes worked themselves out through patterns that seemed to contradict natural order. Joseph's brothers, however, had no patience with mystery. Their hatred of their younger brother grew with each passing day, fed by his obvious favoring from his father, his beautiful coat that marked him as different, his dreams that seemed to promise their subjugation to his authority. They watched him with eyes that had learned to see only what irritated them, forgetting the good qualities he possessed,
focusing only on what they perceived as his arrogance and presumption. The crisis came when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who had taken the flocks to graze in the distant pastures around Dothan. It was a journey of several days, undertaken by Joseph in innocent obedience to his father's request, wearing the coat of many colors that made him visible from a great distance as he approached across the plain. "Behold, this dreamer is coming," they said to one another when they saw him approaching, their voices heavy with sarcasm and long-accumulated resentment. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." The words revealed how completely their anger had consumed their better judgment. These were not evil men by nature. They were fathers themselves, men who knew the difference between right and wrong, sons who had been raised to honor their parents and protect their family. But hatred, given time to grow and fester, can transform even good people into instruments of destruction. Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility that came with birth order and tried to moderate their brother's murderous intention.
Yet Abraham rose early the next morning and began preparations for the journey, his face set like flint, his heart torn between obedience and anguish. He saddled his donkey, cut wood for the offering, took 2 servants and his beloved son, and set out for the place that had been shown him. For 3 days they traveled, each step taking them closer to an outcome Abraham could not bear to contemplate, yet could not bring himself to avoid. When they reached the mountain, Abraham left the servants behind and continued up the slope with Isaac, carrying fire and knife, while the young man carried the wood for his own sacrifice. "My father," Isaac said, and the word must have pierced Abraham's heart like a sword. "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son," Abraham replied, the words coming from some deep place of faith he had not known he possessed. Even in his agony, even facing the loss of everything he held most dear, he continued to trust that somehow, impossibly, love would find a way. At the top of the mountain, Abraham built an altar with hands that trembled, arranged the wood with movements that felt like sleepwalking, bound his son with cords that seemed to tie his own heart in knots. Isaac, trusting his father completely, submitted to what he could not understand, perhaps sensing that they were both caught up in something far greater than either of them could comprehend. Abraham raised the knife, his face wet with tears, his whole being crying out against what he was about to do, yet still obedient to the voice that had never led him astray, even when it had led him into difficulty. At the moment when the blade began its descent, another voice stopped him. "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Looking up, Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns, and he knew that God had indeed provided not just the substitute sacrifice, but proof that the command had been a test of his willingness to trust, even when trust seemed to contradict everything he held dear. He named the place "The Lord Will Provide," and the name became a testament to the principle that would guide believers for all generations to come. The journey down the mountain was lighter than the journey up, but both Abraham and Isaac were changed by what had happened there. They had learned something about the cost of faith, about the willingness of God to provide what is needed when it is needed, about the kind of trust that holds on even when letting go seems like the only rational choice. Sarah lived to see Isaac grow to manhood, to witness his marriage to Rebekah, to know that the promise would continue through another generation. When she died at the age of 127, Abraham buried her in the cave of Machpelah, purchasing the land with silver to ensure that even in death she would rest in the country that had been promised to them but never fully possessed during their lifetimes. Abraham himself lived to be 175, long enough to see grandchildren playing around his tents, long enough to know that the promise of offspring as numerous as the stars was well on its way to fulfillment. When he died, he was gathered to his people in peace, his faith vindicated, his journey complete. The story of Abraham and Sarah became the foundation story for all who would learn to walk by faith rather than by sight, to trust in promises rather than probabilities, to find their security not in what they could see and control, but in the character of the one who had called them to follow. Their journey from Ur to Canaan, from childlessness to parenthood, from uncertainty to confidence, became a map for all who would learn to live as strangers and exiles in this world while seeking a better country, a heavenly one, prepared for those who trust in promises that seem impossible until they come true. In the quiet moments when we are called to leave our own comfortable cities, to trust in promises we cannot see, to walk by faith through wildernesses of uncertainty, their story whispers encouragement. It reminds us that no one is too old to begin again, no promise too impossible to believe, no journey too difficult for those who walk in company with the one who called them out of darkness into marvelous light. And in their laughter, first bitter, then sweet, finally triumphant, we hear the echo of our own deepest longings finding fulfillment, our own impossible dreams coming true, our own hearts learning to trust that love never calls us to journeys it will not help us complete. Isaac grew up under the long shadow of miracle, the child whose very existence was proof that nothing is too hard for the Lord. From his earliest memories, he knew he was special, not because of anything he had done, but because of the extraordinary circumstances of his birth, the angels who had announced his coming, the laughter that had greeted his arrival in his old age. Whereas Abraham had been a pioneer, blazing new trails of faith across uncharted territories, Isaac was by nature a dweller, a man who found his strength in stability, his joy in the quiet rhythms of daily life. He loved the familiar paths through the family grazing grounds, the sound of sheep calling in the evening, the sight of servants drawing water from wells his father had dug. He was content to tend the inheritance he had received rather than seeking to expand it through adventures of his own. His marriage to Rebekah had been arranged through his father's servant, but it had blossomed into a love story as beautiful as any in the ancient world. She had come from Mesopotamia, from Abraham's relatives, a young woman of courage and kindness who had shown her generous heart by watering not only the servant's camels, but all the animals in his caravan. When Isaac first saw her approaching across the fields in the evening light, he loved her immediately, and she brought comfort to his heart that was still grieving his mother Sarah's death. For 20 years they lived together in contentment, yet their happiness was shadowed by the same trial that had tested Abraham and Sarah. Rebekah's womb remained closed, and no children came to fill their tents with laughter and ensure the continuation of the covenant promise. Isaac, having grown up as the miracle child, understood better than most how God's timing often differed from human expectations, so he prayed patiently for his wife, trusting that somehow, in some way, the promise would be fulfilled. When at last Rebekah conceived, her pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. The children within her seemed to struggle against each other even before birth, causing her such distress that she cried out in confusion and pain, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" In her desperation, she sought divine guidance and received an answer that was both reassurance and prophecy. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." The words were mysterious, puzzling, revolutionary. In their culture, birth order was destiny. The firstborn inherited the father's authority, received the greater portion of wealth, carried forward the family name and responsibilities. But here was a promise that the natural order would be reversed, that God's purposes would be accomplished not through human conventions, but through divine choice. When the time of delivery came, the prophecy began its fulfillment in the most literal way possible. The first child emerged red and hairy all over, and they named him Esau, meaning hairy or rough. But immediately behind him came his twin brother, his hand grasping Esau's heel as if already striving to overtake his older brother. The second son they named Jacob, meaning heel grabber or supplanter, a name that would prove prophetic of his character and destiny. From their earliest days, the differences between the brothers were striking. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors who loved the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of bringing home game from successful expeditions. His hands were rough from handling weapons and tracking through thorny underbrush, his skin bronzed by sun and wind, his voice loud with the confidence of one who lived by his physical prowess. Where Esau was impulsive and direct, Jacob was quiet and thoughtful, preferring the company of books and contemplation to the excitement of the hunt. He stayed close to home, learning the arts of cooking and hospitality, developing skills in negotiation and planning that would serve him well in later years. Where Esau was impulsive and direct, Jacob was quiet and thoughtful, preferring the company of books and contemplation to the excitement of the hunt. Isaac, perhaps seeing something of his own gentle nature in Esau's straightforward approach to life, loved his older son best and delighted in the venison he brought home from his hunting expeditions. Rebekah, remembering the prophecy and perhaps recognizing in Jacob's contemplative nature something closer to her own understanding of God's ways, favored her younger son. The household was thus divided in its affections, a situation.
When the door of the ark was opened and Noah's family stepped out onto dry ground, they found themselves in a world washed clean, empty of human presence except for themselves, but full of potential for what might be built with wisdom gained through suffering. The air was sweet and fresh, the earth dark and fertile, the sky bright with promise. Their first act was not to explore or to begin immediate reconstruction, but to worship, to build an altar and offer sacrifices of thanksgiving for their preservation, acknowledgement that they had been saved not by their own wisdom or strength, but by grace that had provided a way of escape when no way seemed possible. And in response to their gratitude, a promise was given that would echo through all generations to come. "Never again will I curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Never again will I strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." The sign of this promise appeared in the clouds, a rainbow arching across the sky, its colors bright against the clearing storm. Not just beautiful, but meaningful, a bridge of light connecting earth and heaven, a reminder that judgment is not God's last word, that mercy triumphs over wrath, that love always finds a way to begin again. Noah and his family began the long work of repopulating and rebuilding the world, planting their precious seeds, releasing the animals to find new homes in the renewed landscape, establishing the foundations of future civilizations. They carried with them the memory of destruction, but also the deeper memory of salvation, the knowledge that even when things seem hopeless, love is preparing a way forward. The story of the flood became a reminder for all generations that actions have consequences, that choices matter, that we are indeed our brother's keepers. But it also became a story of hope, proof that no matter how dark the night becomes, morning will come. That no matter how complete the destruction seems, life finds a way to continue. That love never gives up on its creation. In the gentle rocking of boats on peaceful waters, in the appearance of rainbows after storms, in the patient work of building and rebuilding that occupies so much of human life, the memory of Noah's Ark continues to speak. It reminds us that we are all passengers on a small vessel floating through the vast cosmos, dependent on each other for survival, called to care for the precious cargo of life we have been given to preserve and protect. And when the storms of life seem overwhelming, when the rains of trouble fall without ceasing, when the floods of difficulty threaten to overwhelm us, we can remember Noah's family safe within their floating sanctuary, and know that somewhere, somehow, love is always preparing an ark. In the city of where ziggurats reached toward heaven and merchants counted wealth in silver and gold, lived a man whose heart had grown restless with longing for something he could not name. Abram was his name then, meaning exalted father, though he had no children to call him father and had long since given up hope that he ever would. His wife Sarai, whose name meant princess, had the graceful beauty of one born to nobility, but her arms remained empty of the babies she had dreamed of holding. They were not young anymore, these two whose love had endured decades of disappointment. In a culture where children were considered the greatest blessing and barrenness the greatest shame, they had learned to find their joy in each other, to build their happiness on the foundation of their partnership rather than on the fulfillment of social expectations. Yet the longing remained, quiet but persistent, like an ache that never quite goes away. Was a magnificent city, center of learning and commerce, filled with temples to many gods and opportunities for those ambitious enough to seize them. Abram's family had prospered there, accumulating flocks and herds, servants and silver, all the markers of success in their time and place. By any reasonable measure, they had achieved what most people could only dream of: security, prosperity, respect in their community. But prosperity of the purse does not always bring prosperity of the soul, and Abram found himself increasingly troubled by the emptiness he saw beneath the surface of his city's glittering achievements. The gods of demanded much, but seemed to give little in return, beyond the temporary satisfaction of ritual performed and duty discharged. There was no relationship there, no sense of purpose beyond the accumulation of more wealth, more power, more status. It was into this spiritual restlessness that a voice spoke, not audibly perhaps, but with such clarity that it could not be ignored or dismissed as imagination. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. The instruction was both simple and impossible. Leave everything familiar, everything secure, everything that defines who you are, and go to a place not yet named for reasons not yet explained. The voice continued with promises that seemed to mock their current circumstances. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. A great nation? They were two elderly people without a single child between them. A great name? They were already well known in What could be greater than the reputation they had already built? A blessing to all families of the earth? How could two people, however wealthy or well-intentioned, possibly affect the destiny of peoples they would never meet? Yet something in the voice, Something in the promise, something in the very impossibility of it all, spoke to the deepest places in Abram's heart. This was what he had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting. The adventure his soul had been craving, even as his mind counseled contentment with what he already possessed. The conversation he had with Sarai that night must have been one of the most extraordinary in the history of marriage. "A voice has spoken to me," he might have begun, and gone on to share the impossible call, the unreasonable promises, the invitation to abandon everything certain for the sake of something beyond imagination. Another woman might have questioned his sanity or begged him to reconsider. Another wife might have pointed out all the practical obstacles, all the reasons why such a journey was folly for people their age. But Sarai had lived with Abram long enough to know the quality of his character, the depth of his integrity. If he said a voice had spoken, she believed him. If he felt called to go, she would go with him. The preparations for departure took time. Wealth accumulated over decades could not be liquidized overnight. Servants who had become like family members needed to be given choices about their own futures. Relatives required explanations that probably satisfied no one completely. The community that had known them for so long had to be told that they were leaving for a destination they could not name, for reasons they could not fully explain. But eventually the day came when their caravan stretched out along the road, away from away from everything they had ever known. Camels loaded with tents and supplies, servants driving flocks of sheep and goats, donkeys carrying water and grain for the journey. It was a procession that spoke of both wealth and homelessness, of people who owned much but belonged nowhere. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran, where they had paused in their journey to care for his aging father until death released the old man from his earthly sojourning. 75 years old and starting over, beginning again, stepping out in faith toward a future he could not see, and probably could not have imagined if he had been able to see it. The journey to Canaan was long and difficult, requiring navigation not just of physical distances, but of tribal territories, trade routes, and political situations that shifted like sand dunes in the wind. They were strangers wherever they went, foreigners whose customs and language marked them as outsiders, travelers whose very rootlessness made others suspicious of their intentions. Yet they were not alone. The same voice that had called them from continued to guide them, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through circumstances, sometimes through the quiet inner knowing that comes to those who have learned to listen with their hearts. Step by step, day by day, they made their way toward a land that had been promised but not yet possessed. When at last they entered Canaan, it must have seemed both wonderful and daunting. Here was a land of incredible beauty and fertility, with hills covered in olive groves, valleys green with grain, streams running clear and cold from mountain springs. But it was also a land already inhabited by peoples, with their own gods, their own customs, their own claims to territory that stretched back.
What happened next was swift and final. In a moment of fury that seemed to come from outside himself, Cain raised his hand against his brother, and Abel fell to the earth he had walked with such gentle steps, his blood crying out a testimony that would echo through all generations to come. The silence that followed was unlike any silence Cain had ever known. Not the peaceful quiet of contentment, not even the somber stillness of sorrow, but the awful emptiness left behind when something irreplaceable has been destroyed. He stood over his brother's still form, his anger suddenly gone, replaced by a hollow horror that would never entirely leave him. "Where is Abel, your brother?" The question came as Cain stumbled home, his eyes wild, his hands stained with evidence of what he had done. "I do not know," he replied, but the lie felt like ashes in his mouth even as he spoke it. "Am I my brother's keeper?"
The question was meant to deflect responsibility, but it carried within it a truth he was too blind to see. Yes, we are our brother's keepers, responsible for each other's welfare, called to be sources of blessing rather than curse in each other's lives. What have you done? The voice that asked held no anger, only grief deeper than oceans. The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground. There was nowhere to hide, no way to pretend that evil could be covered by lies or excuses. The earth itself bore witness to what had been done in secret. The consequences that followed were not arbitrary punishments, but the natural results of choosing violence over love, hatred over understanding. The earth that had received Abel's blood would no longer yield its abundance to Cain's hand. He would become a wanderer, restless and driven, unable to find the peace that comes from knowing you belong somewhere, to someone, in the great web of love that holds all things together. But even in judgment, mercy appeared. When Cain cried out that his punishment was more than he could bear, that any who found him would kill him in revenge, a mark was placed upon him, not a brand of shame, but a sign of protection, a declaration that even murderers are not beyond the reach of grace, that vengeance belongs to justice, not to human hands. Whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over, came the promise. Even this first murderer would be allowed to live, to wander, to remember, perhaps eventually to repent. His life was preserved, not because his crime was small, but because every life is precious, every person capable of redemption, even in the darkest moments of moral failure. Adam and Eve buried their son Abel in the earth he had loved, their tears watering the ground where he lay. They mourned not only for the son they had lost, but for the son they had lost in losing him. For Cain, in becoming a murderer, had died to them almost as surely as Abel had died to the world. Their first experience of parenthood had ended in tragedy beyond their worst imaginings. But life persisted, as life always does. In time, another son was born to them, and they named him Seth, meaning appointed, for he would carry forward the line of those who called upon the name of the Lord. Through Seth would come the generations who would keep alive the memory of Eden, the hope of redemption, the promise that love would not be forever frustrated by human failure. And Cain went out from their presence to dwell in the land of Nod, east of Eden, where he built the first city and fathered children who would carry his name into the future. Even in exile, even under the weight of his crime, he was not abandoned to despair. He was allowed to create, to build, to pass on life even though he had taken life. The image of his Creator, marred but not destroyed, still flickered within him. The story of Cain and Abel became the first cautionary tale, the first illustration of how quickly love can turn to hatred when we forget who we are and whose we are. It showed that being brothers in blood is not enough. We must choose daily to be brothers in spirit, to celebrate rather than resent each other's gifts, to guard our hearts against the envy that turns blessing into curse. But it also showed that even the worst human failures cannot separate us entirely from love's persistent pursuit. Cain lived on, marked but protected, exiled but not abandoned, a living testimony that no one is beyond hope, no sin too great for the possibility of forgiveness, no heart so hard that grace cannot eventually find a way to soften it. In the gathering dusk of that first family's sorrow, stars still shone with the same gentle light they had given in Eden's happier days. The sun still rose on just and unjust alike, and the earth, though stained with blood, still brought forth flowers in their seasons. Love had been wounded, but not defeated. Hope had been tested, but not destroyed. And the long story of redemption had only begun. As generations passed and Adam's children multiplied across the earth, the world grew both in wonder and in sorrow. Cities rose where once only wildflowers had bloomed, and human ingenuity created marvels that might have amazed even the first parents. Music was invented, filling the air with melodies that echoed the songs of Eden. Tools were crafted to ease labor and extend the reach of human hands. Arts flourished, creating beauty that spoke to the deep hunger in human hearts for something beyond the merely practical. Yet alongside these achievements, darkness also multiplied. The violence that had begun with Cain and Abel spread like wildfire through human communities. Wars erupted over boundaries and resources. The strong oppressed the weak. Justice became a rare commodity, mercy even rarer. Love itself seemed to be forgetting its own nature, twisted into possession, distorted into exploitation, withering under the weight of selfishness and pride. In this world of increasing shadows, there lived a man whose name would become synonymous with faithfulness in the face of impossible circumstances. Noah was his name, which means comfort or rest, and he walked with integrity through a generation that had largely forgotten what integrity looked like. When others pursued pleasure at any cost, he pursued righteousness. When others lived only for themselves, he remembered his responsibility to his family and his God. Noah was not perfect. No human being after Adam and Eve had ever been perfect, but he was wholehearted. His yes meant yes, his no meant no. His hands were clean not because he had never been tempted, but because he had chosen again and again to resist temptation. His heart was pure, not because he had never known anger or disappointment, but because he had learned to forgive and to trust, even when forgiveness was difficult and trust seemed foolish. He had a wife whose name has been lost to history, but whose faithfulness matched his own, whose gentle strength would prove essential in the days to come. Together they had raised 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each different in temperament but united in their respect for their parents and their understanding that their family lived by different values than the world around them. In a time when violence filled the earth and every imagination of human hearts was only evil continually, Noah's household stood like a lighthouse in a storm, offering proof that another way of life was possible. They were not hermits, cutting themselves off from the world, but neither were they swept along by the currents of their culture. They lived with intention, with purpose, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're walking in paths that lead to life rather than destruction. It was to this man, in this dark time, that an impossible message came. The earth, so beautiful in its creation, so patient with human failure, so generous in its provision, had reached a point where its very survival was threatened by the creatures meant to tend and protect it. The violence and corruption had spread so far that, like an infection in a body, it threatened to destroy.
For a time that felt like forever, days and seasons unmarked by sorrow, weeks and months measured only in deepening wonder, they lived in perfect harmony with all that surrounded them. Lions lay down with lambs in their presence, not because nature was changed, but because innocence has a power all its own. Birds perched on their shoulders like living jewels. Deer fed from their hands like trusting friends. And even the great beasts of the field approached them with gentle curiosity rather than fear. Their evenings were spent in walks with their beloved companion, sharing the day's discoveries, planning tomorrow's explorations, reveling in conversations that touched on every subject under the sun. They spoke of the patterns they saw in flower petals, the mathematics of seashells, the mystery of how birds knew to fly south when seasons changed. Every topic was fascinating because every created thing bore the signature of its maker. But into this perfect harmony came a voice that had not been heard before, subtle, questioning, casting shadows where none had existed. It came through the serpent, most cunning of all the field's creatures, but the cunning was not his own. Has it been said that you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? The question seemed innocent enough, but it carried within it the first seeds of doubt, the first suggestion that perhaps they were being denied something good. Eve, walking alone for the first time in her existence, paused to consider. She looked at the forbidden tree with new eyes, seeing not the loving boundary it represented, but the limitation it seemed to impose. "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden," she replied, "but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden we may not eat, neither shall we touch it, lest we die." "You will not surely die," came the smooth reply, "for your Creator knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like divine beings, knowing good and evil." The lie was wrapped in partial truth, as the most dangerous lies always are. They would indeed come to know good and evil, but not as divine beings, as creatures who had chosen to step outside the protection of love's boundaries. For the first time, Eve saw the fruit not just as beautiful, but as desirable for gaining wisdom. The desire was not wrong. The longing to grow, to understand, to become more than we are is woven into the very fabric of human nature. But this was wisdom sought apart from love, knowledge grasped rather than received, understanding claimed rather than given. She took the fruit, smooth and perfect in her hands, and ate. The taste was all it had promised to be, sweet and complex and satisfying. But even as she swallowed, something shifted in the world around her. The light seemed harsher, the shadows deeper. A chill touched her skin that had never known cold. When Adam found her, she offered him the fruit with hands that trembled slightly, though she couldn't have said why. He looked at her, at the fruit, at the tree, and in that moment faced the hardest choice any human would ever make. He could refuse the fruit and remain innocent while she faced whatever consequence awaited, or he could choose her, choosing love over law, relationship over rightness, companionship over personal safety. He chose her. With full knowledge of what he was doing, with eyes wide open to the consequences, he took the fruit and ate. It was not deception that led him, but devotion, not ignorance, but love. Love that would rather face the unknown together than remain safe alone. The moment he swallowed, both their eyes were opened, just as the serpent had promised. But what they saw was not the enlightenment they had expected. Instead of feeling more divine, they felt more human than ever before. Instead of wisdom, they experienced the bitter knowledge of their own vulnerability, their own nakedness, their own separation from the innocence they had lost. For the first time, they knew shame, not the healthy recognition of wrongdoing, but the terrible awareness of exposure, of being seen and found wanting. They hid among the trees, crafting clothing from fig leaves, but no covering could hide the change that had taken place in their hearts. When evening came and familiar footsteps approached, they did not run to meet their beloved companion as they always had before. Instead, they hid deeper in the shadows, their hearts pounding with a new emotion, fear. The voice that had always brought joy now filled them with dread. "Where are you?" The question echoed through the garden, not because the searcher did not know their location, but because they needed to face what they had become. Slowly, reluctantly, Adam emerged from his hiding place, his head bowed, his voice full of new emotions he had no names for. "I heard your voice in the garden," he said, "and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." The words carried the weight of the first confession, the first acknowledgement that something precious had been lost. The questions that followed were not angry interrogation, but gentle invitation to honesty. "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat?" Each word was an opportunity for confession, for repentance, for the first steps back toward relationship. But fear had changed them in ways they didn't yet understand. Instead of taking responsibility, Adam shifted blame. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." The words blamed not only Eve, but indirectly accused even the giver of the gift. The first finger-pointing in human history, the first attempt to make someone else responsible for personal choices. When Eve was questioned, she too passed the responsibility. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." True, but incomplete. Acknowledging deception while avoiding the choice to listen, to desire, to take. The consequences that followed were not punishments imposed by an angry deity, but the natural outcomes of choosing to step outside love's protection. The serpent would crawl on its belly, its words forever afterwards suspected rather than trusted. The woman would know pain in childbearing. The very process by which life continues would be shadowed with suffering. The man would find his work hard and frustrating, the earth that had cooperated willingly now yielding its bounty only through toil and sweat. But even in pronouncing these consequences, love did not abandon them. The promise came wrapped in the judgment. From the woman's offspring would come one who would bruise the serpent's head, who would undo what had been done, who would make a way back to the garden of the heart, even if the Garden of Eden was closed. The most tender mercy came in the making of clothing, not the rough fig leaves they had fashioned in their shame, but garments of skin, soft and protective, crafted by the same hands that had formed them from dust. Even in discipline, there was care. Even in consequence, there was love. But they could not stay in Eden, not because of anger, but because of mercy itself. If they were to eat now from the tree of life, they would be locked forever in their fallen state, unable to find their way back to innocence. The garden was closed not to keep them out, but to keep hope alive. Hope that sometime, somehow, paradise might be regained. As they walked through the gates for the last time, cherubim with flaming swords, not to threaten, but to preserve what is holy until the time when holiness might be restored. Behind them lay the only home they had ever known, the only life they could remember. Ahead lay a world they would have to make for themselves, where love would be harder, joy more precious because more rare, and hope a daily choice rather than a natural state. But they walked together. Whatever they had not lost each other. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it hand in hand. And somewhere in their hearts, though they could not yet name it, lived the promise that love would not let them go, that the story which had begun in a garden would someday find its way back to paradise, not the paradise of innocence lost, but the paradise of innocence regained, deeper and dearer for having been won rather than simply given. The sun set on their last day in Eden, but it would rise again on their first day in the larger world,
where they would learn that even outside paradise, love finds a way to bloom, hope finds a way to endure, and grace finds a way to make all things new. Beyond the gates of Eden, in a world where thorns grew among the wheat and rain didn't always fall when needed, Adam and Eve began the long journey of learning to live by hope rather than sight, by faith rather than the immediate presence of paradise. The earth that had once yielded its treasures freely now required patience and perseverance, and they discovered muscles they had never needed before, calluses on hands that had known only